The foggy weather turned out to be a massive disaster for the Ukrainians. However, before we go into exactly how that was, we have to take a look at this video here, which shows the foggy weather through the city of Donetsk from a video filmed from one of my viewers of the channel. What we see is that the fog was extremely heavy. You can barely see anything. And this is kind of somewhat the footage from a drone if it was looking down through one of the roads. What we see is that it is extremely difficult for any drones to detect any sort of vehicle driving through, especially with the high speed. This means that drones were significantly less effective today and yesterday compared to the entire war, and this has given unique opportunities for Russian forces and Ukrainian forces to launch offensive operations. The Russians have been much more successful, more on that later. Because the Russians have managed to take full advantage of it, not just in the Pokrovsk direction, but also in the direction of Novopavlivka and Shakhtarske to the north of the city. In the direction of Novopavlivka, the Russians were able to gain control over the highway leading up to Novopavlivka, as well as the fortified positions as the hourglass formation to the south, and the fortified position just on the southern outskirts of the town. At the same time, rush into the northern outskirts of it to cut off the road that connects to the hourglass formation and the fortifications in the northeastern direction. The Russians can make use of this to gain control over the fortified position west of Myrnohrad, and secured control over the road leading up to Novopavlivka from the east, cutting off supplies to the Ukrainian forces remaining in the first line southeast of Novopavlivka, with the Selena River up in the northern flank covering the flank of the Ukrainians. So with this, the Russians are pushing through to gain full control over Novopavlivka, getting an advantage and an additional supply route to their forces operating within the town. All of this happened in the cover of the fog in the morning. The footage coming from the area first shows the Russians gaining a foothold in the central parts, gaining control over the intersection and the fortified position on the outskirts. And then the second you look at the footage showing the Russian presence in the northeast. In the video, we see the Ukrainians striking the infantry fighting vehicle with a drone in heavy fog. What happens with this foggy weather is that the drones are incapable of detecting the Russian vehicles from afar. This significantly increases the effectiveness of the vehicles, especially if they go on secondary roads, off-road positions. Although even if they use the highway itself, the Russians would not be detected until the drone is very close. And with the high speed of the infantry fighting vehicle, it is very difficult to detect them and strike them. This allowed the Russians to take advantage of the weather to drop off infantry within the town. In combination with forces already operating in the southwestern parts, it allowed the Russians to drop off a lot of infantry into the town that are now operating to gain full control over the covered areas and clear them of Ukrainian forces to gain control over the eastern parts of Novopavlivka before moving across the Solena River over to the western parts of the town, which allowed them to gain full control over the entire town, which is one of the two most important logistical hubs on the border between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk region. The logistics of the Russian forces, with the capture of Pokrovsk in the north, Novopavlivka and Myrnohrad in the west, will allow the Russians to connect their forces between the highways, with Pokrovsk connected down towards Novopavlivka through the southern highway, and with Myrnohrad in the western highway, both of them connected to Donetsk city. This means the Russians can redirect their forces quickly between the different directions and have logistical hubs in between them. Generally, the logistical situation for Russian forces in the area and towards the Dnipropetrovsk region will significantly improve. And if we take a look at the Dnipropetrovsk region from this direction, we can see that the Russians will be able to push through the defensive lines and reach into the rear of the fortifications and defenses of the Ukrainians within the Dnipropetrovsk region and the Zaporizhzhia region. Along the second line of defense, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Orestopil, again taking advantage of the fog. Also regain control over Sosnivka and the southern bank of the river line, cutting off Veliko Mikhailivka from the Ukrainian fortifications and positions south of the Vovcha river line, except for the second road that goes across the river line in the east. So one of the two roads have been cut off, and the area the Ukrainians operate in south of the Vovcha river line has been limited significantly to the Myrnohrad direction and this fortified position here to the southeast. With this, the Russians are slowly securing their flank for the offensive operations going further westwards and northwards of the second line of defense to bypass the next portion of it to gain control over the highway connected to Pokrovsk and advance alongside the fortifications down towards the northern flank of Uliapole. Therefore, the Russians have managed to gain significant advantages through the fog. Naturally, the Russians weren't the only ones taking advantage of the fog. If we take a look at the Chesevyar direction to the south of it, in the direction of Stopushki and Perechine, the Ukrainians attempted several counterattacks through the fog, where they managed to reach into Stopushki and Perechine. However, they were unable to consolidate their positions, and the vehicles were destroyed, and the infantry were attacked by the Russian forces occupying both of these settlements. Here we're seeing the clear difference in terms of manpower between the two sides, with the Russians having enough manpower to man their positions while the Ukrainians are struggling to do so. This means with the fog and the reduced effectiveness of the drones, the Russians were able to make significant advances and take advantage of this, while the Ukrainians are struggling to take advantage of it because the Russians do not rely entirely on the drones as the Ukrainians do. However, the Russian gains from the fog does not stop there. They also pushed through to gain full control over Shahove. The initial push, with the support of their forces, clearing the way over the past few weeks, cutting off the supplies and limiting the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians. Now, with the fog as well, they were able to push through to the central parts of the town, push through the eastern residential area and gain full control over Shahove, pushing out the Ukrainian forces and eliminating the encircled portion as well. With this, the Russians have fully gained control over Shahove, which covers the northern flank of Rodinsk. What happens now is that the Russians have gained full control over several roads that lead up towards Shahove and Shahove itself. This allowed the Russians to concentrate their forces through Shahove and regain control over areas in the northern, western, and northwestern directions. This will allow them to start the battle over the quarries, Kocherevyar, Novopavlivka, Vilna, and Ivanivka again, as the Ukrainian counterattacks managed to take advantage of the lack of supplies of the Russian forces. That problem has now been solved for the Russians, and they're able to reverse the situation going forward, especially if they're able to secure Rodinsk and Pokrovsk. The Russian capture of the city itself is coming ever so closer with the concentration of forces. Again, due to the fog, the Russians are able to conduct offensive operations on the flanks of the city, as well as through Myrnohrad itself. On the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over the first buildings within the central apartment complex area within Myrnohrad, separating the northern and southern parts of the city, and advancing through the residential area to the south of it. The main reason the Russians have made so much success within Myrnohrad is due to the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from the city and the absolute hammering of FAB bombs on it, as it has allowed the Russians both in Pokrovsk and now Myrnohrad, as well as Avdiivka in the past, to quickly gain control of these larger cities, because any concentration of Ukrainian forces, whenever detected, is struck by massive FAB bombs. If it's apartment complex buildings or anything else, they are hammered completely until they don't exist anymore. The fighting here is centered around the opening into the city from the south, with the Russians looking to gain control over the railway section to have their forces from the south moving into Myrnohrad from that direction. However, the Ukrainians are still holding some positions in the area. The Russians are pushing through the residential area to cut off the supplies going to these forces and to create a corridor similar to the larger corridor, where they're pushing the Ukrainian forces out of the city itself up towards the northern section, where with the push through the apartment complex area, the Ukrainians only have the roads along the forest lines here in between Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad to withdraw through. This means the Russian push here from the south, from the Sqkm direction, following the capture of the town, towards the city of Myrnohrad from the south, and through Novopavlivka up towards the eastern flank of Pokrovsk. It's all aiming at putting the Ukrainians up towards the northern parts of the city and out of the pocket. To the northeast of this, the Russians captured some positions north of Ryazan, storming the quarries north of the town, looking to gain control over the road connecting Sofivka here in the west with Novopavlivka in the east and up towards Kościanivka. Cutting off this road from the quarries area will allow the Russian forces to push up towards the road and gain control of it to develop offensive operations both in the western and eastern directions, as well as along the forest lines up north towards Mykolaiv, Raiske, and so on. This restart of offensive operations north of Rusin Yar comes as the Russians have captured Sqkm, which will allow them to develop offensive operations along the defensive line along the Krasny Turets River up towards Drushkivka. So we're seeing that the Russians will be developing offensive operations further northwards now that they're nearing the end of the Battle of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. To the southwest, in the eastern flank of Ulyaipole, the Russians started storming Slanyi and Vesele from the east, reaching the outskirts of the settlements from the eastern direction, while Slanyi and Vesele at the same time. The Russian infantry pushing through the first lines up towards the settlements. This time around, there was no cover of fog. Instead, the Russian infantry were moving through the night, trying to stay undetected. However, the Ukrainians, with thermal detection, were able to find these Russian soldiers and strike them with drones. However, fighting continues over both of these settlements, with Russians looking to gain a foothold and gain control of them. We'll likely see a push from the north as well to flank these positions from their weak point, where their fortifications aren't located. Moving up to the northern outskirts of the front line in the Kharkiv-Belgorod border area, the Russians continued their offensive operations, getting closer to the town of Novopavlivka, getting control over additional forest patches here on the eastern flank of the settlement from the Kamyanka direction. Following the capture of the remaining residential buildings and fortifications on the outskirts of Kamyanka, the Russians have restarted offensive operations and are now getting close to Novopavlivka, getting control over which will allow the Russians to connect their forces between Kamyanka and the broader front line along the border section. With this, the Russians continue developing offensive operations to gain control over Novopavlivka and then start pushing in the direction of these settlements along the forest lines and along the settlements through the roads up from Pavlivka in the south, Kamyanka in the east, and Milova in the north. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.